In the chill of the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist rolls through ancient forests like ghostly tendrils, lies the small, unassuming town of Pineville, West Virginia. It's a place where time seems to move at a slower pace, and the past hangs heavily in the air. For most, Pineville is just a quiet town with friendly folks, but beneath its serene exterior lies a darkness rooted in legends and old, whispered fears. This story begins with a man named Robert Bob Turner, a retired Army sergeant who had seen his share of combat in the deserts of the Middle East. Bob was a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy, but what haunted him wasn't the explosions or gunfire of war. It was something far more unsettling that he encountered after returning home. Bob had taken up a job as a caretaker at an old abandoned estate on the outskirts of Pineville. The estate had once belonged to a prominent local family, the Whitakers, whose fortunes had dwindled into obscurity. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the Whitaker estate, about strange happenings and the peculiar deaths of its last occupants. But Bob, practical and skeptical, dismissed these tales as mere superstitions. However, one cold, foggy evening, as Bob was making his rounds through the overgrown gardens and creaking rooms of the Whitaker house, he stumbled upon something that would shatter his skepticism and plunge him into a world of dark, unexplainable forces. Hidden in the attic, behind a wall of old, dusty books and cobwebs, Bob discovered a locked wooden chest. It was an ordinary chest, save for the intricate carvings of symbols and runes that adorned its surface. Something about the chest made Bob's skin crawl, but curiosity got the better of him. He managed to force it open, revealing a collection of old, leather-bound journals, a bundle of yellowed letters, and a strange black book bound in human skin. What Bob didn't know was that these items were connected to the dark history of the Whitaker family, a history that involved a notorious figure from the town's past, a woman named Delilah Blackwood. Delilah was rumored to be a witch, and her name had become synonymous with malevolent sorcery and tragic deaths. The journals and letters hinted at her twisted rituals and malevolent influence, and as Bob began to read through them, he uncovered the horrifying reality of what had transpired in Pineville. Unbeknownst to Bob, the discovery of these artifacts would unleash forces that had been lying dormant for decades. Strange occurrences began to plague him, disembodied whispers, chilling shadows, and unsettling dreams that felt all too real. The lines between reality and the supernatural began to blur as Bob found himself drawn deeper into the occult practices of the Whitakers and the chilling legacy of Delilah Blackwood. As the fog thickened and the nights grew colder, Bob realized that some stories are more than just old wives' tales. They are warnings, and some evils are best left undisturbed. This is Bob Turner's story, a story of courage, skepticism, and the terrifying realization that some things in the world are beyond human understanding. And as Bob would come to learn, sometimes the horrors of the past have a way of reaching out from the darkness to claim the unsuspecting. Bob Turner's first night after discovering the chest was restless. The mansion, with its creaky floors and long-forgotten corners, seemed to be alive with a sinister energy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every gust of wind and groan of the old house seemed to whisper secrets from the past. The old leather-bound journals were particularly unsettling. They detailed the life of Delilah Blackwood, the supposed witch who had once lived in Pineville. Her entries were filled with strange symbols, rituals, and accounts of dark magic. The more Bob read, the more he began to doubt his own skepticism. The tales of curses and malevolent spirits started to feel too real to ignore. On the second night, Bob decided to investigate the attic further. The large wooden chest was the centerpiece of the room, its carvings both intricate and menacing. He spent hours poring over the contents, particularly the black book bound in human skin. The book's pages were filled with incantations and diagrams of esoteric symbols. Bob couldn't decipher most of it, but he felt a chilling aura emanating from it, as though the book itself was alive. As he continued his research, Bob noticed a pattern in the letters. They spoke of a series of mysterious disappearances and deaths that plagued the Whitaker family in the late 1800s. Each tragedy seemed to be linked to a ritual that Delilah Blackwood had performed, involving sacrifices and dark ceremonies meant to grant her power and immortality. One particular entry described a ritual performed in the woods surrounding the estate, a place the locals had long avoided. Delilah had supposedly summoned something from the darkness, something that had driven her to madness and eventually led to her downfall. Bob's curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to explore the woods to see if there was any truth to the old stories. The forest was dense and shadowed, the canopy of trees blocking out most of the moonlight. Bob's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and eerie shapes. As he ventured deeper, he came across an old stone altar covered in moss and overgrown with vines. The altar was marked with the same symbols he had seen in the journals. His heart raced as he realized he had stumbled upon one of Delilah's ritual sites. The air grew colder, and Bob felt a palpable sense of dread. He could almost hear whispers carried by the wind, faint and unintelligible. It was then that he saw it, a dark figure standing among the trees, its features obscured by the shadows. Bob's instincts kicked in, and he spun around, but the figure had vanished. Back at the mansion, Bob's experiences began to take a toll on his sanity. He started to have vivid nightmares of dark figures and shadowy entities. The whispers grew louder, and he felt as though he was being followed. Objects in the house began to move on their own, and the temperature would drop suddenly, leaving him shivering in the middle of the night. One evening, while researching the old letters, Bob found a reference to a binding spell meant to contain the dark forces Delilah had unleashed. The letters suggested that the spell had been performed by a group of townsfolk who were trying to stop Delilah's rampage. The spell was said to have been cast on a specific night under a rare alignment of the stars. The date was approaching, and Bob realized that he needed to perform the spell if he wanted to stop the hauntings. Desperation led Bob to seek out the local historian, a woman named Agnes Caldwell, who had lived in Pineville all her life. Agnes was knowledgeable about the town's history and had heard the legends about Delilah Blackwood. She was initially skeptical, but agreed to help Bob after he showed her the evidence he had found. Together, Bob and Agnes prepared for the ritual. They gathered the necessary ingredients and items described in the old letters. As the night of the ritual approached, the atmosphere in the mansion became increasingly oppressive. The air was thick with tension, and Bob felt as though something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night of the ritual arrived, and Bob and Agnes made their way to the stone altar in the woods. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly, aligning in the pattern described in the old texts. The ritual began, and as they chanted the incantations, the darkness around them seemed to pulse and writhe. Just as they neared the climax of the ritual, the ground beneath them trembled, and a cold wind howled through the forest. Bob felt an overwhelming presence, a force that seemed to be fighting against the spell. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, and the shadowy figure Bob had seen earlier reappeared, more menacing than before. With determination and fear, Bob and Agnes pressed on, finishing the incantation just as the wind reached a deafening roar. The darkness seemed to recede, and a sudden silence fell over the forest. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. Exhausted but relieved, Bob and Agnes returned to the mansion, only to find that the disturbances had ceased. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. However, Bob knew that the darkness they had faced was not entirely vanquished. Some evils, he had learned, are never fully eradicated. They merely lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. As Bob looked out over the now quiet forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows still held secrets, and that the fight against the darkness was far from over. The days following the ritual were calm. Pineville seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, and the Whitaker mansion, once again, fell into a quieter routine. Bob Turner continued his work as the estate's caretaker, and life slowly returned to what passed for normal in the small town. But the sense of unease Bob felt never completely faded. There was a lingering suspicion that the darkness hadn't been entirely banished. It was a feeling that gnawed at him, like an itch he couldn't quite reach. Despite the apparent peace, Bob noticed subtle signs that something was still amiss. Shadows that moved oddly, whispers that seemed to drift through the halls when he was alone, and the occasional cold spot that defied explanation. One night, as Bob was cleaning out the attic, he found an old, forgotten drawer hidden behind a false wall in the attic. Inside were a few more items he hadn't seen before, a series of old photographs, some of which depicted the Whitaker family members in eerie, unsettling poses. One photograph in particular caught Bob's eye. It showed a woman who looked remarkably like Delilah Blackwood, standing in front of the same stone altar Bob had seen in the woods. Her eyes seemed to follow him, and a chill ran down his spine. Intrigued, Bob decided to visit Agnes Caldwell to discuss the find. When he arrived at her house, he noticed something strange. The usually vibrant and warm Agnes seemed unsettled and pale. She invited Bob in, but was noticeably nervous. Bob showed her the photograph, and Agnes's face went white. "That woman," Agnes said, her voice trembling, "isn't Delilah Blackwood. That's Eleanor Whitaker. She was Delilah's niece. I thought she died years ago." Bob was taken aback. Eleanor Whitaker's name had never come up before. Agnes explained that Eleanor had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and her fate had always been a subject of local legend. Some believed she had been a victim of Delilah's dark rituals, but others thought she had simply vanished without a trace. The discovery of Eleanor's photograph and the unsettling realization that she was connected to Delilah Blackwood led Bob and Agnes to investigate further. They delved into old records, searching for any clue about Eleanor's fate. As they pieced together the history, they uncovered a disturbing truth. Eleanor had been deeply involved in her aunt's dark practices and had continued them even after Delilah's death. One night, as Bob was alone in the mansion, he found himself drawn back to the attic. The whispering voices grew louder, and the temperature dropped significantly. He approached the old chest, which had been left untouched since the ritual. As he opened it, he discovered a hidden compartment containing more items, strange artifacts, and a new set of journals, this time belonging to Eleanor. Reading through Eleanor's journals revealed that she had continued her aunt's work, seeking to harness the dark forces for herself. Her final entries spoke of a plan to transfer her consciousness into a different form, ensuring her existence beyond death. The journals hinted at a ritual that could allow her to inhabit another's body. Feeling a growing sense of dread, Bob realized that the ritual they had performed might have done more than just contain the dark forces. It might have unintentionally enabled Eleanor to complete her sinister plan. The last entry in Eleanor's journal was dated just before Bob's arrival in Pineville, and it ended with a chilling note. "The time is almost here. The vessel must be prepared." Bob's heart raced. The vessel mentioned in the journal could very well be him or someone else close to him. The thought that Eleanor might still be out there trying to fulfill her dark ambitions filled him with a profound sense of horror. As Bob stared at the chest and the eerie artifacts, he felt a presence behind him. Turning around, he saw the shadowy figure again, but this time it was clearer, more defined. It wasn't just a ghost, it was Eleanor, or at least something that had taken her form. The figure spoke in a cold, hissing voice. "You thought you could stop me, but you've only delayed the inevitable. The darkness is eternal, and so am I." The figure vanished, leaving Bob in the dim light of the attic, the old artifacts and journals surrounding him. Bob knew that the fight was far from over, and that Pineville's secrets were far deeper than he had imagined. He left the mansion that night with a sense of foreboding. The darkness was still out there, and the past had not been fully laid to rest. Bob understood that some horrors are not easily vanquished, and that the shadows of Pineville would always hold their secrets close.